The river roared like an angry beast, pulling everything into its dark, unforgiving depths. Just when it seemed certain the Apache woman would vanish beneath the current forever, a cowboy dove in, risking his own life to pull her back to shore. But what began as an act of courage quickly turned into something far greater than he could have imagined. For her tribe declared that by sacred law, she now belonged to him. Bound by honor, tradition, and a destiny neither of them chose, they would face trials of love, fear, and loyalty, discovering that sometimes the greatest battles are not against raging waters, but against the currents of the heart. The river was merciless that day, swollen from days of relentless rain, its surface foaming with fury as if it carried the weight of every storm that had passed through the valley. John Cartwright had seen floods before, but something about this one felt different, as though the river itself was alive and determined to take whatever it wanted. He had been riding along the ridge, his horse uneasy beneath him, when the faint cry reached his ears. At first he thought it was the shriek of a bird carried on the wind, but then he heard it again, sharp and desperate, piercing through the thunder of the rushing water. He dismounted without hesitation, his boots sliding on the wet earth as he ran toward the sound, every muscle in his body taut with urgency. When he reached the bank, his heart seized at the sight before him. A woman, her arms thrashing wildly, her body being dragged mercilessly downstream, her long black hair tangled with reeds and debris, was fighting for her life against the untamed current. In that instant, time seemed to slow. He didn't consider the danger, didn't think about what might happen to him if he dove into that raging torrent. All he knew was that if he did nothing, she would die before his eyes, swallowed by the same river that had claimed countless others. He stripped off his coat, tossed his hat aside, and without another thought, leapt into the frigid water. The shock hit him like 1,000 knives, stealing his breath, but he forced his arms to move, his legs to kick. The current dragged him under, twisted him, slammed him against hidden rocks. His lungs burned as he fought to break the surface, gulping in air before the river tried to pull him down again. His eyes searched desperately, and then he saw her, a flash of terrified eyes, her hand reaching out, her strength fading with every second. He pushed forward, every stroke of his arms a battle, every heartbeat echoing with the thought that he might not make it. But he did. He caught her wrist, his grip unyielding, and pulled her against him. She was weak, trembling, coughing as water filled her lungs, but she clung to him with the last shred of strength she had. Together they were tossed about like driftwood, but he held her close, determined that if the river wanted her, it would have to take him too. The struggle to reach the shore was a blur of pain and determination. He kicked against the current, driving them toward a patch of land that jutted into the water. His muscles screamed, his body battered by the force of the flood, yet he refused to surrender. At last, with a final surge of will, he dragged her onto the muddy bank, collapsing beside her as his chest heaved, his heart hammering in his ears. For several moments, neither of them moved, both gasping, both trembling from cold and exhaustion. Then she turned her face toward him, her dark eyes wide and filled with something that struck him deeper than gratitude. It was recognition, as though she had seen into his soul in that moment of life and death. Her lips parted, but no words came, only a soft broken sound as tears, mixed with the river water, still clinging to her cheeks. John pulled himself up, ignoring his own shivering, and removed his soaked shirt to drape it over her shoulders. She was small beside him, fragile yet somehow unyielding, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself. He built a fire with trembling hands, coaxing sparks into flames, and guided her close so the warmth could chase away the cold that threatened to consume her. For the first time since he had seen her in the water, he asked her name. "Ayana," she whispered, her voice soft yet carrying the weight of her spirit. He repeated it under his breath, the syllables foreign but beautiful, and in that moment he knew he would never forget it. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing her strength, even in her weakness. She spoke haltingly, telling him how she had come to the river to gather herbs, how she had slipped on the slick rocks, and how the current had taken her before she could cry for help. She looked at him as though he were a figure pulled from the realm of spirits rather than a man of flesh and bone. John, for his part, found himself strangely quiet. He had saved people before, but this felt different, as though something larger than himself had guided his steps to that riverbank. When she shivered again, he placed his coat around her shoulders and kept the fire alive, watching her as though ensuring she would not slip away from him even now, when she was strong enough to stand. He helped her rise, steadying her when her knees trembled beneath her. She leaned on him as they made their way from the riverbank, each step slow, but with every moment she seemed to regain her strength. He thought he would simply see her safely to her people and then leave, returning to the solitude of his wandering life. But as they crested the hill and the first figures of her tribe came into view, he sensed that the river had not merely tried to take her life, it had changed his own forever. The tribe rushed to meet her, their cries of relief filling the air, but their eyes soon turned to it. Gratitude was there, yes, but also something deeper, something measured and solemn, as if they saw more than just a man who had pulled a drowning woman from the water in that moment. Before a word had been spoken, John realized he had stepped into a story far greater than his own. He had not just fought a river that day. He had crossed a threshold into a world bound by laws and traditions older than he could comprehend. And as he looked at Ayana, her gaze steady despite her exhaustion, he felt that invisible thread tightening, drawing him toward a destiny he had never sought but could no longer deny. The moment John and Ayana stepped into the heart of the Apache village, silence fell like a heavy blanket over the gathering crowd. Children stopped their games, women carrying water set their burdens down, and warriors emerged from the shadows of the lodges, their eyes sharp and unyielding. Ayana was quickly surrounded by her people, their hands reaching out to touch her, to assure themselves she was truly safe, but every glance drifted back to John, the stranger who stood among them. He was drenched, his clothes torn from the river's unforgiving grasp, his chest rising and falling with the effort of each breath. Yet he stood tall, his gaze steady. He did not expect gratitude, and he certainly did not expect what came next. The elders emerged, their faces carved with lines of wisdom and hardship, their eyes shining with the fire of tradition. They listened as Ayana, her voice trembling but clear, recounted what had happened, the slip on the rocks, the desperate struggle, the hand that had pulled her from death's grasp. When she finished, silence lingered, thick with the weight of unspoken meaning. Before the chief, an imposing figure draped in eagle feathers, raised his hand and declared that the sacred law had spoken. John did not understand at first. He thought it was simple thanks, a recognition of what he had done, but the murmurs among the tribe told him otherwise. The chief's words rang out again, stronger this time, declaring that by the ways of their people, a man who risked his life to save a woman from the river was forever bound to her. The river, in their belief, was no ordinary force of nature. It was the lifeblood of the earth, the spirit of destiny, the divide between life and death. To pull someone back from it was not merely an act of courage, it was an act of union, and in the eyes of the spirits, such a bond could not be broken. John was stunned, the weight of the declaration pressing down on him like the current had in the river. He had expected to save a life and move on, but now the tribe spoke of him as if he had been chosen, as if fate itself had drawn him into their circle. Ayana stood silent as the decision was proclaimed, her head bowed, her face unreadable, yet her hands trembled as she held her father's arm. The crowd watched her, waiting for her reaction, and though her cheeks flushed with a deep, quiet blush, she did not resist. To her people, the sacred law was not something to be challenged. It was older than memory, carried in the stories of ancestors, a law that bound not only the living but the spirits who walked beside them. She accepted the decision with grace, though inside her heart beat wildly, uncertain of what it meant to be tied to this stranger whose life had intersected with hers in such a sudden, unshakable way. For John, it was bewildering. He wanted to protest, to explain that he had not meant to claim her, that he had only done what any man should have done in the face of danger, but when he met the eyes of the tribe, he saw their reverence for the law. To argue would not only insult them, it would dishonor the life he had saved. The tribe began to speak among themselves, some voices welcoming the bond, others heavy with suspicion. Many still remembered the wounds left by settlers, the broken promises, the land stolen, the families torn apart. To them, John was still a cowboy, an outsider tied to a people who had long been enemies. Whispers drifted through the crowd like smoke. Could he be trusted? Would he respect their ways? Or had the river forced upon them a union that would lead only to sorrow? John felt the weight of those stares, sharp as arrows, piercing into the core of who he was. He had come west to escape his own past, to find peace in the solitude of cattle drives and campfires, and now he found himself at the center of a story he could not walk away from. Every instinct told him to leave, to slip back into the wilderness before the bond solidified, but when his eyes found Iana's, he froze. There was fear in her gaze, yes, but also a quiet strength, a willingness to accept what had been placed upon her. She did not choose it, but neither did she shrink from it. The days that followed tested them both. The tribe watched him constantly, measuring every word, every gesture, waiting for him to reveal whether he would honor the sacred law or defy it. Ayana was caught between duty to her people and the uncertainty of this bond. She was proud, unyielding, yet she too wondered who this man truly was, this stranger who had become by tradition her husband. At night, John lay awake under the stars, listening to the crackle of the fire, his mind restless. He thought of the river, of how close death had come, and of how fate had twisted his path into this new, uncharted course. Part of him longed to run, to return to the world he knew. But each morning he rose to find Ayana nearby, her presence calm, her gaze steady, as if silently daring him to stay. There was no bond of choice between them, only one written by the river. Yet with each passing day, something deeper began to grow still. Challenges arose with every step. Warriors of the tribe, proud and protective, did not welcome him easily. Some saw him as a threat, others as an intruder who had forced his way into their most sacred law. They tested him with questions, with silent stares, even with open hostility, and John, though patient, felt the strain. He had never asked for this bond, and yet he began to realize that it was not only Ayana he must prove himself to, it was an entire people, a nation bound together by tradition and memory older than he could comprehend. And so he worked quietly, helping where he could, learning their ways, offering respect even when respect was not returned. He did not push, did not demand, but carried himself with the steady endurance of a man who had lived through storms before. Slowly the sharpness of their suspicion dulled, though it never fully disappeared for Ayana. The weight was different, but no less heavy. She bore the glances of the women, the murmurs of her peers, the knowledge that her life had been altered in an instant. She wondered what it meant to belong to this man, to share her spirit with someone who came from a world so far removed from her own. Yet each time she remembered the river, the strength of his arms pulling her from its grasp, she felt a thread of trust. He had not hesitated when others might have watched helplessly. He had not let go when the current tried to claim them both. And though she did not yet understand him, she sensed a depth in him, a shadowed pain he carried, that made her believe he was not as distant from her world as it seemed the declaration of sacred law had bound them in the eyes of her people. But it was in the quiet moments, the shared glances by the fire, the soft exchanges as they learned each other's languages, the unspoken trust that grew with each trial, that the bond began to take root in truth rather than tradition. The river had not simply pulled her into his arms that day. It had carried both of them into a destiny neither could have foreseen, a current far stronger than any flood, one that now swept them toward a future neither dared to define. But both knew they could no longer deny. Their first true test as a bond declared by sacred law came sooner than either of them had expected. It began with a whisper among the people, carried from one fire circle to another, until it reached the ears of both John and Ayana. Settlers had crossed into Apache hunting grounds. For years, such tensions had simmered just below the surface, igniting into violence when anger outweighed reason. To the Apache, their land was more than soil. It was the resting place of their ancestors, the foundation of their survival, and the keeper of their spirit. To the settlers, however, it was opportunity, a chance for crops, for cattle, for expansion that cared little for sacred ground. John knew both sides too well, and the weight of that knowledge settled heavily on his shoulders. The warriors of the tribe gathered, their voices sharp with anger, their eyes burning with the fire of protection. Some wanted to ride out immediately, to confront the intruders with arrows and rifles, to remind them that Apache land was not theirs to take. Others counseled caution, but even their voices carried an edge. When John stood among them, every gaze turned to him, as though he were not only part of the tribe by law, but also a test of how far his loyalty reached. John's heart wrestled with conflict. He had once been a settler himself, had lived among men who believed land could be claimed with fences and deeds. He knew their stubbornness, their sense of entitlement, and their willingness to fight for what they wanted. Yet standing among the Apache, he also understood the depth of what was at stake. This was not merely about territory. It was about identity, survival, dignity. He felt the eyes of the chief upon him, weighing him, waiting to see whether he would remain silent or speak. Iana, standing at his side, gave no signal, no words to guide him, yet he felt her presence steadying him like the ground beneath his boots. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying across the circle, low but firm. He told them he knew the ways of the settlers, knew their weaknesses, their fears, and their stubborn pride. He urged them not to rush into bloodshed, for once violence began, it would spread like wildfire. The settlers were not easily swayed, their faces hard, their words sharp, but John pressed on, reminding them of the strength of the tribe, of the futility of trying to conquer what would never belong to them. He appealed to their pride, their fear, and their sense of survival, weaving his words carefully. Balancing warning with reason, the warriors behind him watched in silence, ready to draw steel at the first sign of betrayal. But the confrontation did not turn to violence that day. Instead, after long tense moments, the settlers agreed to pull back, grumbling but unwilling to test the resolve of the Apache with an outsider standing firmly in their way. John returned with the warriors, his body weary but his spirit stirred. For the first time, he had not simply been a man caught between two worlds. He had acted as a bridge. Yet even in this fragile success, he knew the peace would not last forever. The settlers would return, or others would take their place, for the hunger for land was endless. But for that moment, war had been stayed, and lives had been spared when he returned to the village. The reaction was cautious, but undeniable. The tribe looked at him with new eyes, no longer just as the man bound to Ayana by sacred law, but as someone who had stood for them when the shadow of conflict loomed. Respect did not come all at once, but it began to take root, like the first shoots of grass after a drought. For John, it was both a relief and a burden, for with respect came expectation, and with expectation came responsibility. He had not chosen this path, yet it had unfolded before him, and he could not turn away from it. Ayana, watching him, saw the struggle in his eyes, the way he wrestled with who he was and who he was becoming. She did not press him, did not demand words he was not ready to give, but her presence was a constant reminder that the bond they shared was not merely a matter of tradition, it was becoming something deeper. Forged in the fires of trial, the days that followed brought smaller challenges that tested him in quieter ways. A warrior offered him a bow, testing his skill with it. An elder asked him to help repair a shelter, watching to see if his hands carried the patience to work alongside theirs. Children followed him curiously, whispering about the cowboy who had been claimed by the river. Each trial, small as it was, shaped him further into the role he had been given. Some nights, he lay awake by the fire, staring into the flames, wondering if he was strong enough to carry it all. But when he turned his head and saw Ayana nearby, her eyes closed, her face peaceful, he felt the weight shift. Perhaps the river had not chosen wrongly after all. Perhaps it had not bound him to a burden, but to a chance to become more than the man he had been. To find redemption not in solitude but in belonging. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he began to walk it, step by step, guided not by the laws of the land he had once known, but by the sacred law that had claimed him in the heart of the river's fury.